Thank you. Joe, I don't know if you can see me.
I can actually. I can't see
Okay.
your slides, but I can see you. I'll just listen for the slides.
Okay, great. Well, thank you
I
so
must
much
admit, I
for.
was a little intimidated when I heard that you were going to be the respondent because I very much admired, particularly your book on the immigrant to the United States. That was something that very much inspired some of our work.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm very honored by that, and I loved hearing your presentation. It was really interesting, and I'm afraid I probably won't do justice to it, so I apologize just to begin with. I wanted to do two things, make some general remarks, and then in the spirit of your PowerPoint, I kind of created a baby PowerPoint as well that I'll use at the end of my remarks. And I wanted to start by invoking an essay that I really love to use in this context, Salman Rushdie's Imaginary Homelands. And it's really a terrific essay. I come back to it all the time and have reread it almost in a Talmudic way. A 1981 essay, and it's about being an Indian writer in England and the idea of home and homeland. And I'll just quote from him to start. It may be that when the Indian writer who writes from outside India tries to reflect that world, he is obliged to deal in broken mirrors, some of whose fragments have been irretrievably lost. And yet, Rushdie asserts the right to write from that fragmented place about the homeland where he no longer lives, saying, and I quote now, "We are now part of the West. Our identity is at once plural and partial." So I think that gets a little bit of what you're speaking about as well, this kind of transition from diaspora to plurality. Also wanted to mention so I'm going to make some comparisons to the Cuban diaspora. Gustavo Pérez Firmat, a literary critic, writing in 1994 about life on the hyphen. And speaking of Cuban Americans, he talks about the creation of Little Havana in Miami and says, well, it's a deficient, incomplete copy of the original, but sometimes that's the best we have. And he identifies three stages of Cuban identity formation outside the island that might also be relevant to thinking about Latinos in general, and the case of Tejanos in Austin and in South Texas. So, like one stage is substitution. So you substitute what you had in the new place. So we're there now in the copy and in the fake, so to speak. That's kind of stage one. Stage two is destitution. We're nowhere. We're lost. Can't have anything back of what we had before. And then institution. Well, here we are. It looks like we're here to stay. Let's create new spaces for ourselves, a new relationship between person and place. So I think that might be a useful concept as well. And then Pérez Fidmat also talks about the relationship between tradition and translation among immigrants. And I think this is something that we see continually in all kinds of diasporas. Tradition, again, in quotes, but keeping some sense of the culture of home and then being able to translate it in a new context, whatever the new home is, reconstructing that elsewhere. So immigrants, diasporas are very much defined by this kind of translational sensibility, this ability to go back and forth between places. And the translational sensibility in particular, I think, very much defines 1.5 generations. At the same time, there's something that would be interesting to talk about, and I'm sure you do this elsewhere, which is the marketing of different diasporic cultures as well, so that we have something like Taco Bell as well, which is kind of like a marketing of Mexicanness. Now, I think Latinos, perhaps, and I'm not sure whether I can really say this is unique to Latinos as a diaspora. I'll just go ahead and say it, and then you can all tell me that I'm wrong. But I think one thing that might be unique to us is that Latinos are immigrants who arrive, say, in the States, but then there's always more coming from our initial homeland. So there's always kind of like this revaccination, from the original culture. And of course, you see that very much with Mexicanos, and you also see it very, very much with Cubanos. I've been spending time now doing research in Miami, and you can see all the different layers up through the present day of Cubanos coming through Miami and continually kind of revaccinating, in a sense, the culture with fresh Cubanness. So there's this kind of constant process of re-Latinization, in a sense, taking place, and assimilation, if we want to just call it that in quotes, is continually halted or put into question by this new, fresh immigration that brings new information about the home places, but also brings traditional cultural forms of behavior, so that things are kind of kept in place while they also change. And all these different vintages of migration, they merge, and old and new immigrants reconnect, sometimes in very class stratified ways, which is something, Joe, that I'm sure you think about a lot. It's, when we have a category like Latinos, we have to also be able to nuance it. And I know what happens very much in the Cuban case in Miami is you have the first wave of immigrants who came over in the 60s, overall being quite successful because they've had a longer time to establish themselves, and then newer immigrants in a class hierarchy are doing much less well and often feel some resentment towards those earlier immigrants. So those are some things to think about. But I think that it's very curious that in the Latino case, the culture of home is in a sense not allowed to become distant because it's always brought close again by new waves of immigrants. So a couple of just different thoughts that I had. So one of them is that we really can, in terms of area studies and issues of that sort, we can't separate Latin American studies, say, from Latino studies. And I have a lot of issues about that and really feel like they should be viewed together. And then this whole issue of pan-Latino identity was so interesting. I really like the way you talked about that. And it's so complex because, yes, there's many things that tie people together from Latin America and the Caribbean, but of course there are many differences, not only national differences, being a Mexican, a Brazilian, and a Cuban, obviously all very, very different, but within Mexico you have tremendous differences. If you're from Monterrey or from Chiapas, these are very, very different ways to be Mexicano. So all these distinctions need to be taken into account, as do the generational differences that you talked about. And I think for me a key issue is memory. What is held on to, what is lost, and what is deliberately abandoned. And I think that is something to always think about. What is common ground and how is it defined and redefined continually? And the case of Austin is so interesting. When I lived for 3 years in a town in San Luis Potosí, which is just about 6 hours south of Monterrey. So we would drive, actually, my husband and I, from Michigan down to San Luis Potosí, and we would always stop in Austin, on the way and then on the way back as well. So it's very much a place that's part of my geography, and I think it is a really fascinating, as you said, transnational border region that really goes from South Texas all the way down to Monterrey and possibly even further south. And what's so interesting is that even as the border grows tighter and taller, the fence grows stronger, people still flow back and forth and, in a sense, question the existence of that border. There's this kind of interesting circuit that exists. Now, as you were talking, I started adding more notes all around my typewritten notes, and now I can't read either one very, very well. But what I'm feeling the need, and I think this is as an ethnographer who likes to work kind of very microscopically, I'm feeling the need to see more people in this story. I'm certainly getting a sense of Austin as a place and as a location on the map, but I'd like to see a little bit more of the people. I'd like to see what they do. Are they, dancing? Are they drinking? Are they eating barbacoa? And I'm sure that more of those kind of ethnographic details are in the larger project, but I'd like to see more of that, and I'd like to also think more, and I know you mentioned that you weren't going to be able to really get to it, but the nuances of gender, I think, are very, very interesting, at least from what I've been able to observe. Women tend to use the phone and telenovelas more to communicate, and men may perhaps use more internet and other forms. So I think that would be very, very interesting to be able to get at some of those nuances a little bit better, and to look at this whole relationship between re-Latinoizing and de-Latinoizing and kind of how it shifts. I'll just mention my mother as an ethnographic example as a Cuban immigrant. For a long time, she worked as a secretary at NYU, and she's now 75, retired a few years ago, and she started watching telenovelas, and now she's hooked on them. She does watch the Mexican telenovelas in particular. She watches that at 9 p.m., so between 9 and 10 p.m. you can't talk to her. And then my Aunt Sylvia watches it as well in New Jersey, and then at 10 p.m. they call each other to discuss what they just saw. But what's so interesting is my mother says that she's now forgetting her English because she's just watching too many telenovelas and too much Spanish language television. So her case is kind of a case of re-Latinoizing, so that it's very much a process of shifting of identity. And so on. So, and the other thing that I guess every time that we talk about Latinos in this kind of boxed, constructed sort of way, I always want to shift it and turn it around and also think about the Latinoization of the United States, because I feel that sometimes these conversations can feel a little bit claustrophobic, and I'm just sort of imagining like these Latinos like boxed in somewhere. But in fact, what we're also seeing is that the Latino culture is having a huge impact on the U.S., has been, of course, at least since the 40s. And so the impact of Celia Cruz and Gloria Estefan and Ricky Martin and J-Lo and Mark Anthony and the Buena Vista Social Club and so on. Argentine tango is now all the rage and so on. So we also have this kind of Latino culture changing the United States. So those are some general thoughts. And another one is that I think while we need to keep looking at migration to established Latino centers, so that Mexicans generally go to South Texas or California, Cubans generally go to Miami, but at the same time we also need to look beyond, because there's new immigration patterns forming, so that you have a lot of Mexicanos in New York City, for example, you have Cubanos in Arizona, and so that these patterns are also changing quite a bit, and that's another thing that's extremely interesting. Why do people leave? I guess I still want to understand that question a little bit better, the meaning of migration in the present. If the internet does bring us all closer and connect us all, why then move to other places? So people still move. What does diaspora mean? And now if I can do this, I'm not used to this kind of just the arrows will do it. Okay, so I'll try to be super fast because I think I'm over my time, and just give a couple of ethnographic examples from my own work. So as was said, my initial field work was done in a small village in northern Spain, a village of 150 people, where I lived in the late 70s and early 80s. And here's a lady from the village, very, very traditional at the time village. People worked agriculture in traditional sorts of ways. You could see here, and there was I as a young woman, and I wrote a book that very much kind of, I guess, emphasized the traditionalness of this place, and it was a place that many people had abandoned. The youth had abandoned, the villages had abandoned agriculture and gone to cities all over Spain, Madrid, Bilbao, and so on. And I felt this kind of desire to support these people that had stayed and to kind of honor the people that had stayed. And what's interesting is I lost touch for a little while, but then people started to find me through the internet, particularly second and third generation people of the elders that I had worked with in this village, who were now very curious about the traditions of their village and the history of their village. And I had of course, collected quite a lot of information and quite a lot of photographs also from the late 70s and 80s. And so I was just back in Spain this summer, reconnected with people in Santa Maria. And now, as you can see, there is a website for the village. And interestingly enough, it was created by this young man, well, now in his 40s, now not so young, but he was the first child that I met in in Spain. He was 8 years old at the time, and now he has created this website, and it's kind of a virtual community for the village, so that those who have left can also continue to feel connected. So it's actually not about connecting to the world, but it's rather about recreating a tiny world, a patria chica. So it's about recreating this one small place. They're not interested in the connection to the rest of of the world or even knowing about other villages. It's their village that they're interested in. And curiously enough, in León, this is in the province of León, they have now just built an ethnographic museum. So a lot of the things that I got to see in action in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of those tools that people were using are now in glass cases in this ethnographic museum near the village. So tremendous change in just the last 30 years. And as was said, I made a movie, Adiós Querida, about 9 years ago, and it was an effort to examine the Sephardic Jewish community of Spanish origin in Cuba. And it was a film dedicated to my father, whom you see here, a Sephardic Jew from Cuba, who adamantly refuses to go back to Cuba because of his politics and so on. And I wanted to make a film for him so that he could see that his tradition, his Sephardic tradition, was still alive in Cuba. And one of the things I did, and this was one of the ways in which you can work to create virtual communities, is I put him in the same film with Sephardic Cuban Jews living on the island, and in particular spent a lot of time interviewing two young people, this boy Miguelito, who as you see is Afro-Cuban and also a Sephardic Jew, and then Danaida, whom you see here with her father, and she is Jewish on her father's side, and her mom is Afro-Cuban and a Jehovah's Witness. And I met her, first of all, when she was 4 years old, and she had just received a teddy bear from a visiting Jewish American mission, and there have been many going to Cuba in recent years trying to connect with this tiny community of 1,000 people on the island. She had received that teddy bear, and for me, that teddy bear was the first kind of seduction of the global for her. And here she is with her mom, Jehovah's Witness, and from a very early age, when she knew that as a Jew she could eventually migrate to Israel, she began to dream of leaving. Here she is with her father. And her sister, Omni, her older sister, who has the same mother but a different father, so she's not Jewish. Her sister Omni left after the making of Adiós Querida, because Omni is also featured in the movie. She left for Poland, a very unexpected diasporic location. She was singing salsa in Havana, and she was discovered by a fellow Cuban who had immigrated to Poland and had a salsa group and needed a woman salsa singer for the group. So off she went to Poland, but then she got tired of this male-dominated salsa group, and sorry. And I don't know if I have it. Oh, maybe I don't. And she formed, oh, no, I don't have it. Sorry. I wanted to show you a picture. She formed her own all-women salsa group with Polish women. And she is La Cubana in this Polish group. So a very different kind of diasporic location, obviously, for Cuban, and she's now totally fluent in Polish. I got to go to Poland a few years ago and meet up with her, and it was really amazing because people would do double takes when we would go into a bar. They would expect me to speak Polish because I was white, but of course I don't, and she was speaking totally fluent Polish. So that was very interesting, and I'll move quickly because I think I'm taking a lot of time. And here's Danaida again, her sister, her Jewish sister back in Cuba. This was in July 2007. She just married her neighborhood boyfriend. They'd just gotten their passports, and a few months later, she was leaving for Israel, leaving her mother behind, which was a source of great sadness, and leaving with her father and her then husband, who she later divorced in Israel. No, I think it was his fault. But so what I wanted to say here is to say something to you about the these seductions of globalization and the important role that women are now playing in migration and globalization and plurality and diaspora and so on, both of them in very different ways. No time to go into it now, but dealing with their blackness in these very, very different parts of the world and how they're being perceived is very interesting. In the case of Omni, on the street, she feels tremendous racism, but when she's on stage, she says people love her precisely because she's a black Cubana. So that's been one experience for her. And then for Danaida in Israel, her experience has been that she's taken for Arab or she's taken for Ethiopian. Nobody really thinks that she's a Jew. And so that's been very, very complex. And so these are now two women who speak Polish and Hebrew in addition to Spanish, very, very different kinds of trajectories. And all of this leads me to think that that the concept of multi-sided ethnography may not be enough, but I'm not sure what we have instead. I think our research will become more comparative as time goes on, but perhaps also more superficial as we try to take on the movement of our subjects. And I think it's also interesting that our subjects seem to be more mobile now than we anthropologists are. Anthropologists used to be the ones that moved, and subjects stayed in fixed locations. Now it's the subjects that move, and we're kind of in our fixed locations in our academies. So I think that's an interesting shift. And just to end, we'll almost end. So Danaida communicated with me in the initial moments when she got to Israel via email, and this is one of the emails that she sent, translated from Spanish to English, and talking about missing home, missing even the potholes in the streets that she had hated so much when she lived in Cuba. And there she is now in Israel with her father, Beersheba, and to be fast, the fascination, I'll wrap up, fascination with Cuba. And I just want to end, this will take less than a minute, with Yoani Sanchez, that some of you may have heard of from Cuba. She's a world-famous blogger, Generation Y. And you may know that, that the internet is blocked in Cuba. People are allowed access to email and to some state-sanctioned sites, but not access to the web freely. And Yoani Sanchez has become this blogger who sends her blogs by email to her supporters, who then post them on this site. And she's a very interesting person because unlike those who just leave, she actually left Cuba and then chose to return. She was, I think, in Switzerland, and then decided, well, I don't want to be away from Cuba speaking about Cuba. I'm going to go back to Cuba. She returned and decided to exercise her right to free speech in Cuba via cyberspace. This website is not accessible from Cuba. It's accessible outside of Cuba. And so she's kind of become one of these celebrity leaders, but at the same time, she's making an important point about reverse diaspora as well. And sometimes you have to go back to be able to speak about the things that need to be done at home. So thank you.